Welcome back to this second part of this morning on sustainable alpine forests. I'm trying to, from the experience of the first session, not to lose too much time with speaking myself. You have seen me already, so you know who I am, and I'm jumping directly into that session, second part, which is sustaining ecosystems services in mountain watersheds and the potential of digitalization. So there will be an introductory presentation by Giacomo Grassi, who is sitting on my left-hand side here from JRC. We agreed that he will introduce himself, so please, Giacomo, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks for inviting me. I'm Giacomo Grassi, work at the Joint Research Center, who is the scientific branch providing scientific support to policymaking in Brussels. You heard this morning Marco Onida. We contribute to provide scientific evidence to the legislations like the one you heard this morning from Marco. So, next slide, please. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't
okay, thanks.
The green button is
okay. Well, I start with this, with a story, because the relationship between science and policy on forest is often complex. And the story starts from two men in a balloon that get lost over a forest. And they see two persons below them and ask where they are, because they are lost. The people below tell them, well, you are latitude X, longitude Y, and then the person above, they say, well, you must be a scientist. I asked you a simple question, you gave me too complex information, and I'm still lost. And below they say, well, you must be a policymaker. I gave you an accurate answer, but you don't understand, and you blame me. I start with that because sometimes the relationship on complex issues like forest mitigation, adaptation, the communication is difficult between science and policy, and different perspectives are possible. Well, let's start why forests are so important to fight climate change. And let's start with what science says about the global carbon cycle. On the left side, you see the anthropogenic emissions, mostly from fossil fuel, but also about 15% from land use changes, mainly tropical deforestation. Where these emissions go? And you see on the right where these emissions go. Nearly half remains in the atmosphere, creating the global warming that we all know about. But luckily, not all remains in the atmosphere. More than half is absorbed. About 25% by oceans and about 30% by terrestrial ecosystems, mostly forest. So you can see from this picture that the management of forest resources is on both sides of the equation. It's part of the problem with land use changes and deforestation, and part of the solution with the removal of CO2, the sink of CO2, which removes CO2 from the atmosphere. And this concept is has been taken up by policy, and the Paris Agreement in that respect has been a real game changer. Why? Because it declared within the objective to stay within the 2 degrees by end of the century, well below 2 degrees. And to this aim, following the advice by the IPCC, by science, asked countries to reach a balance between anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 removals. So we may wonder, which are the best tool to remove CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the best technology? Well, to be clear, the best technology we have now are forests. Forests are the most important CO2 sink that human can measure. However, of course, it's complex to measure, it's complex to identify what is anthropogenic, and of course, this capacity should not be used as an excuse for inaction in other sectors. Of course, a rapid decarbonization in all other sectors is anyway absolutely needed. This narrative is well reflected in the EU climate target. You can see the red line are the net emissions The positive numbers are emission toward atmosphere. The negative numbers are removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So on the positive side, so emissions toward the atmosphere, you can see all sectors, energy, industry, and transport. And below you see the so-called land use change, and forestry sector, the LULUCF sector, which at the EU level absorbs about 7% of total emissions. 7% seems not a big quantity, but as you can see, the more we go toward climate neutrality, which has been decided by the EU to be reached in 2050, the more the importance of the forest CO2 sink will increase over time. In 2050, most of the remaining emissions that cannot be brought to zero in the other sector is expected to be absorbed by forest. We have a problem though. The current sink is decreasing for a number of reasons that we have also heard this morning. Because harvest is increasing, because there is increasing wood demand, because there are increasing natural disturbances, because forests are getting older. And the new LULUCF proposal, which is part of the Fit for 55 package that has been released mid of July this year, aims essentially to stop and reverse soon the current decline of the sink. And this is a major challenge that we have ahead of us. However, forests can deliver more than just the CO2 sink. We heard also this morning, I really have to congratulate with the speaker this morning. It was an excellent set of presentation. And actually here I'm just connecting many of the dots that you heard already this morning. So the sink is essential, but there is even beyond the sink. Wood products may help fighting climate change as well. But then a number of questions arise, and these questions reflect different perspectives and sometimes trigger a heated debate. What is better for the climate? Should forests be harvested more or less? Should wood use be in energy or in construction? To answer this question, we need to enter in a system perspective. System perspective means that we have to understand the relationship between the LULUCF sector, the green box, the forest sector, the red box, and the other sectors. And we need to understand that there are different mitigation options, which include increasing carbon stock, which is the net sink in forests, but also in harvested wood products, that there are substitution effects using wood for material use instead of cement or steel, for example, or for energy. And we need to understand the trade-off exists between options, because if you increase harvest, you have more wood available for material or energy substitution, but then you have a decrease in the net sink in the short, medium term, that from a forestry perspective means few decades, so it's a long period. In conclusion, we need a system perspective, bearing in mind that what is important is maximizing the sum of all mitigation options, not only one mitigation option, not only the material substitution or the sink, the sum of the two. We need a holistic assessment, including multifunctionality, of course, including socioeconomic aspect, biodiversity, and the need of adaptation and resilience that we heard so well this morning. There are some widely applicable recommendations. So get better data. Sometimes we still lack good data. Remote sensing will help, will not solve all the problem, or will help. Increase the net forest annual growth, including through better management in new forest area, shift the use of wood toward long-lived products and high substitution benefit, prioritize circular economy and cascade use of wood, especially for bioenergy, and analyze trade-off at local level. There is no one solution that fits all. Governance tool and financial incentive have to be defined at country level to encourage win-win pathway. At the end, it's not only a matter of harvest quantities, but it's also a matter of quality, better forest management and better use of wood. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, especially also for this last quote, or not a quote, but like making a very clear statement of what we are needing. So this was the introduction, and that directly then moves us into this what is called panel 4 on the agenda, which is sustaining ecosystem services. The first presentation is going to be given well, actually on the On the agenda is Michele da Pozzo from Regione d'Ampezzo in the Dolomites, which is the national park in Italy. It's Regione d'Ampezzo Collective Property Woodlands. You will see him. I was announced for like 10 seconds or so, and then you will hear John Stewart to give the presentation. So please, Michele.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. You might bet the pronunciation. I kindly ask for help from John Stewart as a speaker of my report. Thank you very much.
Regole d'Ampezzo Collective Property Woodlands. As you see in Chart 1, the forest heritage of the community of the Regole d'Ampezzo covers slightly more than half the total area of the property, and a little more than a third is destined to production forests. Until a century ago, the ownership of the Regole aimed above all to guarantee grazing areas for families, with the forest relegated to a secondary role, mostly aimed at local needs and only afterwards to timber trade. Collective ownership and localized and occasional use of timber, limited to the needs of the community, led over centuries to the formation of old, mature, mixed and stratified woods. This didn't happen in nearby valleys where large feudal properties dominated, maximizing the exploitation of forests, even at the expense of local populations, or otherwise large mining centers where large amounts of wood were burnt in furnaces. The Ampezzo woods grow on a calcareous dolomitic substrate, nutritionally poor and unstable, which prevents the widespread formation of large fertile woods and leads to slow growth of tree soil. Because of the very long time to maturity, at least 100 years, there is still the formation of high-quality timber. Forests with limited fertility, growth, and density are also more stable and resilient to extreme weather events such as water stress, wind and heavy snow accumulations, as well as to pest attacks. Protection forests are largely made up of Scots pine, not very productive, but essential for the protection of slopes from increasingly frequent debris flows. These protection forests are also very rich in biodiversity. On the other hand, pine forest habitats are the most vulnerable to the risk of fires, historically very rare in the Ampezzo area, but in recent years an increasing threat. The next slides, 2 and 3. Next slides.
Go.
Clearly show the variety of species and types of forest habitats covering the Ampezzo Dolomites, a variety which explains their extraordinary biodiversity and landscape. The high micromorphological variety, the low average fertility, and the history of the Ampezzo woods certainly do not encourage a strong profit-oriented forest activity. However, most of the Regole forests are in fact actively managed, even if at low intensity. The capillarity of the forest road network and the constant maintenance of access routes, useful also for tourism, allows small and localized interventions to be carried out across most of the property. The so-called Cador cut, also called selective cut or cure cut, practiced for centuries by the Regole communities of the Eastern Dolomites, aims also nowadays to provide good quality woody assortments, although not in large quantities. Entering a forest parcel with a cure cut on average once every 15 years, we collect a reasonable amount of good quality woody mass, and at the same time we remove from the entire forest parcel area crooked, malformed and subordinated trees. Firewood is collected. Natural renewal, already in progress in the largest clearings, is encouraged and strongly favoured by each cure or healing cut. Preconditions for the practice of cure cutting are obviously a widespread accessibility of the management units, as well as the constant maintenance of the road network, as well as a willingness by the property to accept modest and constant incomes over time, rather than to make large profits in a short time. Another precondition of the practice of cure cutting is having on site specialized forest companies capable of carrying out forest activities without damaging the wooded area that remains standing. This is no longer so obvious nowadays. Concerning the direct and indirect damage caused by the Vaya storm, to date, there have been tree crashes for about 45,000 cubic meters and deaths from bark beetles for about 20,000, with a total loss of 65,000 cubic meters, accounting for slightly less than 4% of all the Regole woods. Of these, about 40,000, 60% of the total, have been or are being recovered, since they are accessible and provide an adequate economic return. Substantial incentives have been awarded to the regional administration of Veneto to compensate for tree crashes caused by Vaya. It is estimated that the total deforested area is about 500 hectares, or slightly more than 3% of the total wooded area. This figure appears quite comforting compared to the damage inflicted to nearby valleys. As you see in slide 4, hopefully, the current net income from forest activities of the Regole is around 80,000 to 100,000 euros per year. The Regole access the public incentives of the Rural Development Plan whenever possible, but are still able to support the management of their assets without public aid. However, it is hoped that the landscape recreational, naturalistic, environmental, ecosystem benefits, as well as the stabilization of slopes and carbon sequestration, will sooner or later be adequately recognized and remunerated by European environmental policies. Currently, instead of hundreds of hectares devastated by clear cuts, a heavy legacy left by the Great War of a century ago, there are coeval tree thickets of the same age of 80 to 90 years, still not mature and very vulnerable to climatic events and parasitic attacks. These thickets are emblematic of the vulnerability of woods, deriving from the notorious and vast clearing cuts. Interventions absolutely unsuitable for the resilience and stability of the medium-high mountain forests in the Dolomites.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and also for reading it. I think in the interest of time, we have directly to move, so to say, from a good example in the Dolomites towards facing complexity. So the next speaker is going to address managing for complexity, sustaining ecosystem services in the context of climate change. And this is Emanuele Lingua from the University of Padua. I hope you're hearing us and you very good. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so you can hear me and you can see my share screen?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks a lot. So my presentation actually is a follow-up of all the presentation that actually we had this morning. So I've been widely introduced the concept and the topic. And actually, the subheading of my presentation is actually provided by Professor Harald Bugman, that is management matter, actually. And just jumping into the presentation and try to say sometimes. So Since the beginning of the morning, we talk about the ecosystem services provided by alpine forest that are fundamental, not only for the people living in the valley, but also for people living far away from these mountain ranges. And ecosystem services is not simply some new value that recently have been taken into consideration, but also started from the wood production, so timber production, so productive forest. So we need to sustain like local production, to sustain a local community, as we have seen on the previous presentation, a long way in the long term with the sustainable forest management. But in order to sustain all the ecosystem services, not only the production, we need to really introduce the management some new approaches. And sometimes also looking at in the past to find the good solution in order to provide and to enhance the ecosystem service provision from alpine forest. And actually, if we look at the forest management, we are looking at different stands that are in a gradient of situation, where sometimes we want to increase the protection of these ecosystems, or sometimes we need to produce a lot. So in a range from conservation forest to agroforestry, but there is like a gradient to different situation. And actually silvicultural measure and forest management really can play a role from less intensively managed native forest to intensively managed forest and plantation forest. And here is the place where the silvicultural intervention can work in order to enhance the resistance and resilience of European forest, and also to conserve and promote biodiversity also in the managed forest. This is probably the key point of the future forest management. And I have to say that sometimes there is a misunderstanding of some terms, and probably sometimes we are not really able to transfer and to share the correct meaning of some scientific terms or indices. And one of the common one is the biodiversity, but biodiversity is different than number of species, but the general public is just thinking about that. And with forest management, we can do really a lot on this, because in temperate forest, in mountain forest, we cannot look at high number of species in the forest, in the tree cover, at least at the tree species. But we can work on structural diversity. That is a part, a very important part, maybe even the most important part in mountain forest, biodiversity. But also we have to remind that in the alpine forest, in the alpine environment, biodiversity is not a synonymous of naturalness. So we are living in an environment that has been managed from millennia, and it is still managed. And so if you are selling postcard and landscape that we really appreciate, actually, this is the result of forest management and landscape management. So we are living in a cultural landscape that also is an hotspot for biodiversity. So with the management, we can and we have and we should maintain this kind of diversity that has been generated by sustainable forest management for years, for centuries. Also, as we have seen from the nice good example of Regole d'Ampezzo in the Dolomite Mountains. Of course, with the forest management, we can alter, we can affect the forest structure directly, and this is the way how we can maintain and enhance biodiversity. We can maintain and improve biodiversity in managed forest, and also we can manipulate our stand in order to obtain a more resistant and resilient forest. And we have to think about the forest at two different levels, two different scales. So we can intervene at the stand scale or a single tree level, increasing the horizontal and vertical structure of our forest, and adapt and enhance, also increase tree species distribution, tree species composition of our stand. And mainly we have to promote deadwood quantity and quality in our mountain ecosystem, as Arad already suggested in the first slide. Because these are providing habitat structure, increase the presence of this habitat, tree habitat element, and also we need to have like aged stand or all the tree in our system. And previously, Giorgio Vacchiano told us that the National Forest Inventory new data we implemented for Italy yesterday. And the presence of deadwood, the average presence of deadwood in our forest is around 14.7 cubic meter per hectares, and it increased from the previous inventory that was only 8.8. But still, we are a little far away from the minimum that we consider enough for a target for a sufficient biodiversity in our forest. So we need to retain some all the trees, big trees in our silvicultural systems, and also maintain deadwood in our system in order to provide a forest manage for multi-purpose and to providing more ecosystem services. And this is at the stand scale and also at the landscape scale, at the regional scale, the importance of forest planning and to deal with these problems, to increase resilience, increase resistance, enhance and maintain biodiversity in our mountain stands, also at a bigger scale. And we have to maintain maybe unmanaged forest patches, so some reserve, but it's not a matter of segregation. We need to include also in the regular management, and so in regular stands, some parameters, some factors that are increasing biodiversity and resilience and resilient effect. And of course, we cannot apply all of the points that we discussed this morning and I showed in the previous slide in all the forest. Even if it's a complex system, we cannot adopt a very complex approach. But we need to at least act in locally, maybe at the standard level in order to obtain big results at a large scale, but also it's correct, as Giacomo was saying at the beginning, there is not a one size fit all. So we have not a general rule that we can apply all over Europe, all over like the mountain forest. The silvicultural strategy should be site specific and species specific. And always we have also to remember a local community and socio-economical issue. Concerning climate change, probably since some years ago, we always faced and study and observe like the chronic effect of climate change, so the gradual changes. But now we are facing a period of abrupt changes, so natural disturbances. So people now really notice this and the effect of climate change. And recently in the Alps, in Italian Alps, actually, there are pictures coming from 2017 fires in the Western Alps, 2018 Vaya storm in the Eastern Alps, and now we are facing the bark beetle outbreaks that we will see in the next presentation. So big scale event, large event that were not really considered in the past. So now we are called for, again, for afforestation in a lot of situations. And we already discussed about the species, the provenance and the quality. But I want to just highlight this point and going to the conclusion that also for the EU forest strategy, so 3 billion additional trees in Europe by 2030, and for Italy, roughly will be like a 200 million of trees. But the tree nursery sector, the tree nursery system in the past have been neglected because we relied on natural regeneration, so close to nature silviculture. So now we need to invest in a new tree production, in seedling production, in order to really reach the European goal that are quite ambitious. But also we have to remind that is a complex, we are managing from complexity, a complex system. So restorative systems is not simply planting trees. We are entering the decade of ecosystem restoration, and as a silviculturist, as a forest manager, we have a big responsibility since we need to create a more resilient forest, but not only by planting trees, but also by creating a stable and resilient ecosystem. And thanks for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Emanuele. This was a very interesting overview on what diversity actually means, not only the numbers and all that, and how to cope with it. I think this gives an excellent introduction into the next presentation, which is now going into the conflicts of those issues, managing conservation conflicts, a vital component to tackle the climate crisis. This is given by Chris Pollard, from the Forest Research in the UK. So please, Chris, the floor is yours. You can see your slides.
Hi, can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, I can hear you and we see your slides. That's perfect.
Thank you very much. Hi, good morning. My name's Chris Pollard. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm a behavioural scientist from Forest Research. We're the research agency for forestry in the UK, and we're the GB principal organisation for forestry tree research. I'm going to talk a little bit about conflicts and cooperation. So, as already mentioned elsewhere and in many places now, there's ambitious tree planting targets across the UK and forward-thinking strategies about how to manage forests and woods and even individual trees in the era of climate change. Got two examples here. We've got the Scottish Government woodland creation targets and the UK Government's Tree Health Resilience Strategy and its 5 behavioural goals. So it's just examples, but as climate change has moved up the agenda, we've seen the increased focus on our social and economic research group start to answer some of these complex questions about how to deliver these ambitions. And we've been approaching these alongside the ecologists and the foresters within forest research, and then collaborations outside as well. Now, of course, there are other aims and goals and objectives in the world, and they're held by a vast range of stakeholders, and they're about land use, about where funding comes from and how it's used, and about individuals and actually how they live their lives in relation to trees, woods and forests. So because of this vast range of objectives, the perfect scenario, of course, is to find synergies here. For example, you can plant trees for carbon sequestration. You might have benefits to biodiversity, recreational opportunities and productive forests. Brilliant, that's the perfect scenario synergies. But we're all realistic, and we've talked a lot, other speakers have talked already today about trade-offs and understanding the measurements of ecosystem services and those different kind of benefits, measuring those so we understand the trade-offs between them and different options that we have, and then we can debate and have agreements, and they're tough decisions, but move forward with those. But in some cases, there are extreme ones. You'll have these disagreements in objectives, and then you'll have instances where one party perhaps or is perceived to assert their interests over the other, and that's the definition of conservation conflict there. So 2 UK examples from a number of years ago. These are both urban examples rather than alpine, but I hope they'll understand the relevance here. First one was street trees in Sheffield in England. They were felled, and that caused protests by residents. This was really high profile. It made the national news. And secondly, experiences of residents following eradication of an Asian longhorn beetle introduction. The paper here describes how eradication was hailed as a success. It worked in terms of stopping the beetles, but from a policy point of view, great. But residents had some really serious criticisms about how eradication was done and the way that the process was followed through. So conflict can have these extra potential consequences, not only trade-offs where you're losing one thing or another, but the potential consequences of the conflict itself in terms of time and money. It could be legal challenges, this delay of this essential climate change action or conservation actions that you're trying to implement, they're just delayed and delayed. And then those two things at the bottom, loss of trust and reputational damage, which you might be able to overcome the introduction of the beetle initially, but then in the future, are people going to be on side with you when you're trying to do things again? Trust and reputational damage, very, very important. So here I'm just showing a general conflict management process. I've simplified this from a tool which is designed for conservation agencies. But just to go around it quickly, from the top there is mapping. So understanding the conflict, then moving round to the right, bringing folk together for multi-stakeholder approaches, moving around, discussing evidence, and then having transparent processes, monitoring valuation, and then prediction, trying to anticipate future conflict. My time's brief here, of course, so I'm going to show an example of the social science work we've done alongside spatial scientists at Forest Research to look at this one about multi-stakeholder approaches and inclusion, to rigorously represent the complexity of people's values for better decision making. So the aim here to avoid and manage conflict. So this was a study done on the attitudes to landscape benefits. It was placed in southern Scotland in the hills there. And here we used interviews and this LandPref tool. So this tool is an interactive landscape visualization. It allows participants, the members of the public, whoever you're talking to adjust a virtual landscape using these rich cartoon images that you see in the center there. They can pick what they want in the landscape, what their preferences are: turbines, energy production, recreation, sheep farming, commercial forestry. And it also fed back on the level of carbon sequestration based on the choices that were made. And the key thing here is that the combinations of what they could choose are constrained by a rule-based algorithm. So they can't just pick everything, or they have certain selection between the different potential choices. And the data to create those rules is from this area in southern Scotland. So the data collected, the ecological, the soil data collected right here and fed into this for the local people or the people in the area to start to make their decisions. So really working together. For this particular example, there was strong support for wilderness and nature and timber production. And there was little support for energy and turbines and actually for farming. And there was also little support for not doing anything, so didn't want business as usual. But the key here is that this interdisciplinary research is helping those working to reach those planting targets, to put the trees in the right places, crucially here with buy-in from those who live and use the hills. So finally, I just want to emphasize again the importance of this interdisciplinary working between scientists. Forest Research have this year just begun a new set of 7 core programs developed alongside the governments in England, Scotland and Wales. 6 out of these 7 of the programs include the social and economic researchers. So I think that just shows that the impetus to discover behaviour and to get people involved, not just relying on previous natural science, but also trying to get as many people involved in making these decisions as possible, is seen as the way forward in order to combat these complex problems. There's much work to do to tackle climate change, of course, and working across these boundaries and closely with stakeholders as well. Getting stakeholders really involved in the process is there to minimise these conflicts and increase the amount of cooperation that's required. So I'll just acknowledge my team in the Social and Economic Research Group in Forest Research. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for this overview on sort of how potential conflicts and other threats could be handled. We are expanding our perspective a little bit into a food perspective also. Building resilient mountains and mountain food systems is going to be presented by Rosa Laura Romeo from the Mountain Partnership Secretariat at FAO. So Rosa Laura, you're here. Very good to see you, and we hope that we can also hear you and see your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a few slides. Okay. Can you see my screen?
We see your screen, and please, if you go to the presentation mode, that would be great.
Yes, I'm trying. Yes, should be okay right now, right?
That's perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about mountain and food system, in particular about the impact of the pandemic on the mountain food systems, but allow me to start sharing some basic stats about mountains and mountain people around the world. So mountains cover about 27% of the Earth's surface, so they are a big part of our land. and they host about 15% of the world population. So more than 1 billion people live in mountain area, and the majority of these people live in developing countries. So basically out of this 1.1 billion, 1 billion live in developing areas. They have a very important functions, as we all know, because they provide fresh water to at least 50% of the humanity, and they are home to a lot of biodiversity. We also know that about 62% of mountain people live in rural areas, where, of course, agricultural production is a small-scale affair. So most mountain agriculture is done by small farmers and pastoralists. Just a few information about the Mountain Partnership where I work. The Mountain Partnership is the only United Nations alliance that deals with mountain development and supports the livelihood of mountain people. Includes now more than 400 members, including 60 governments and many, many civil society organizations that are really the backbone of this alliance. This Mountain Partnership is supported by a secretariat that is hosted in the forestry division of FAO, and this secretariat exists thanks to the support of Italy, Switzerland, and Andorra, to which we are very grateful. In preparation for the Food System Summit that, as you may know, took place on the 23rd of September, we organized a lot of activities. We provided background information, case studies, and info sheet, because mountain food systems are very relevant for mountain people, but also very relevant for people living in the lowland. So we organize a lot of activities, a lot of engagement of our members to ensure that the mountain food system could be included in the process. And you can read more on our website if you want to know how this was carried out. But allow just me to say that in mountains, agricultural techniques are a mix of traditions and innovation. We know that many techniques have been fine-tuned throughout the centuries, and they have found ways to be very resilient, they're very sustainable. The relation with the environment is a very healthy one. But we also know that sometimes this disruption can happen, and this has a big impact on the livelihood of mountain people. Mountain agriculture is based on biodiversity. There are a lot of varieties in each agricultural area in the mountains, and this is, of course, a way to adapt to events, to extreme events, to pests, etc. So the diversity of the variety use is a very important resilient factor. And this is something that should be protected when we look at protecting and enhancing mountain food systems. We also know that mountain agriculture, even if it's, of course, less productive than the agriculture in the lowland, is important for many reasons, not only because it's the backbone of the mountain economies, but it's also fulfilling some important ecosystem functions, because they protect the slopes, they contribute to the water retention, and we also know that mountain soils are very important carbon sink. So mountain agriculture, beyond the productive factor, has very important functions that they fulfill, and this is why it should be protected. We have been conducting studies to look at the mountain food insecurity since the year 2000, and unfortunately, the food insecurity in mountain areas continues to increase. Our last study was in 2017, and we found out that the food insecurity in mountain areas, in rural mountain areas, was about 53%. It means that this is the possibility that people go without food throughout the year. There are other factors that are contributing to, there are several factors that are contributing to this food insecurity in mountain areas. We know that mountain areas are often far away from the capital. They have limited access to infrastructure. They have fewer markets and services access to credit, etc. So there is all this element of marginalization in terms of social and economic infrastructure. There are also the natural hazards, which have always been a reality in mountain areas, but nowadays, because of climate change, are increasing. And the land degradation is also another important element in many mountain areas that is contributing to this erosion of the food security. Another big element that's terribly contributed to increase the food insecurity, and we haven't been able yet to quantify this, is the impact of the COVID-19 on the mountain food systems. We know that the challenges that were added to the COVID-19 to mountain areas had basically reduced the access of mountain people to markets. Many supply chains have been disrupted. There was a ban in many cases on food export. The tourism almost disappeared in most mountains for at least 2 seasons. And there was this has caused an increase in the inequalities and the marginalization, the lack of access to basic services. These are some data from the World Bank. They are not specifically referring to mountain areas, but to rural areas at large. But I think it's quite relevant to look at this. We know that in mountain areas, the livelihood of people is mainly based on 3 sources of incomes that are agriculture, remittances, and tourism. And these 3 were seriously affected by the pandemic. So we expect that the situation for food insecurity in mountain areas during the pandemic has decreased the availability of food, so it's worse than it was before. This is because there is less employment. This is because there is less access to input and to output markets. The middlemen, the intermediaries, had more difficulties in accessing mountain areas because there was a ban in many areas for traveling. And also because of the overall, the global economic crisis, there was a general decline in the purchasing power of consumers. If we look at what can be done to improve the situation in mountain areas and to ensure that mountain people are not left behind, but are fully included, we need to look at options in a very integrated manner. So basically, there is a lot that can be done if we look at the supply chain with an holistic approach, trying to include elements of innovation in the supply chain, but also valuing the traditional knowledge, the traditional practices, and the traditional products that are highly appreciated by the consumers. We need to enhance, of course, the food safety and the nutritional quality to allow these products to reach the market and have the needed standard. We need to strengthen the capacity of the agri-food enterprises to ensure that they can compete in the international market. And the other big issues now is this improving the public-private partnership to ensure that the food processing and the food loss is reduced to the minimum. The mountains need investment, we know that. And so investment for green recovery are really an important element. And of course, we need to ensure that the institutional policy environment is a conducive one. So we say that the local authorities and the local communities of producers should be really empowered to be able to develop their own business and their own specific policies.
Excuse me, Rosa Laura, can you please come to an end?
Sure. I think this is basically my last slide. So we need to protect the traditional and indigenous food system. We need to include the impact of climate change and ensure that land rights and tenure issues are fully included. Allow me to say that women play a very important role in the process because women are often left in mountain areas as the custodian of this ecosystem. So it's very important that women are in the driver's seat and fully empowered. So yes, thank you very much. And thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, thanks a lot, Rosa Laura, for this overview on the food chain aspect in mountain areas. And so with this, we move to, well, back to the forest, so to say, to the more precisely to risk to forest, to mountain forest ecosystem services due to natural disturbances. And this is going to be presented by Anna Stritti from ETH in Zurich. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matthias. So we've already heard a lot today about natural disturbances in mountain forests and also about the ecosystem services in these forests. So I'm going to try to link the two a bit and also talk about some tools that can help us to cope with this risk to mountain forest ecosystem services, and specifically how Earth observation and other tools can help us to anticipate risks and also to better manage these risks. So when we want to anticipate the risk to forests or forest ecosystem services, it's important to understand where these risks are more likely to occur and which are the forests that are most susceptible to natural disturbances in this case. So just an example of a study that we use to do that is we use a combination of satellite detected natural disturbances. So this is in the canton of Graubünden, and this is just a series of examples of disturbances that happened just in the year of 2018. And those disturbances we can detect now from, in this case, from Landsat time series, but also from other forms of remote sensing data. And when we combine this with forest management records, then we can really give these disturbances a context and understand which are the drivers or the agents that are causing these disturbances, whether it's wind throws or bark beetles or snow breakage, for instance. And when we have a large data set of these type of disturbances, we can start to analyze what are the factors that determine which forests are more or less susceptible to these disturbances. And we did this for the canton of Graubünden, and we found some things that we can all expect based on already the talks that we heard today. So spruce forests are more exposed to natural disturbances, especially at lower elevations, at south-facing slopes, so in warmer sites. So this is all pretty clear. But we also found some things that we were not expecting that much, or that were more interesting. For instance, the fact that the way that the land has been managed in the past has an influence on the forest's susceptibility to disturbances today. So specifically, forests that were established about 100 or 80 years ago on former agricultural land that are mostly very homogeneous, dense spruce forests are today the ones that are most susceptible to disturbances at the moment. And what was even more interesting for us was that forests that had been recently managed during the last 10 years were actually also more susceptible to natural disturbances on the short term, because their stability was reduced due to this management interventions. So what does this tell us about reducing the susceptibility of forests to disturbances? So one thing is that it's important to maintain those old and structurally rich and diverse forests that are more stable, and to prioritize maintaining those forests because they're more likely to be able to provide services on the long term. And when we do management interventions that are often now aimed to increase the resilience, so for instance, thinning to promote certain tree species and so on, these management interventions should take place quite early in the stand development in the forest, before these stands reach this very vulnerable phase when they're very dense and homogeneous. So that we can anticipate risks a bit, understand which forests are more susceptible, but we cannot really always prevent these disturbances from happening. So how do they affect ecosystem services? So we've already heard a lot about ecosystem services of mountain forests, so all of these benefits that we get from forests in landscapes like this. But how are these then affected by disturbances? So we've already heard a lot about the negative effects, like the potential loss of stored carbon, the instability in wood production because of disturbances, or the negative effect on forest cover and therefore protection from natural hazards. But there's also some potentially positive effects of natural disturbances. So, for instance, they can increase the landscape and habitat diversity and provide dead wood, which we've already heard is really important for biodiversity. Dead wood can also play a really important role in the protective function of forests. So if it remains in the stand after a disturbance, it can actually help the forest to still provide some protection from avalanches, for instance. And actually, when we look at the effect on landscape beauty, this really depends on people's perception and their awareness of the effects of the importance of dead wood, for instance. And all of these effects can be either mitigated or even exacerbated by salvage logging. So that's really something that is important to consider. For instance, if we leave dead wood in the forest, it might help to maintain the protection function of the forest, but it might also increase the risk of some further disturbances by bark beetles. And what's also important to note is that all of these are short-term effects, but on the long term, when we have disturbances that increase the landscape diversity and increase the forest structural diversity, this can actually also facilitate the forest adaptation to climate change. So how can we combine this information and use it to help support management? We can use remote sensing as well as other data and local knowledge and feed it into models to get maps of ecosystem services, like this one here in the Lower Engadine, which shows the forests that are most important in providing avalanche protection. And we can use this kind of information to prioritize where management for more resilience should take place, because we sometimes cannot manage everything. And we can also combine this with information about the risk based on natural disturbances to see the spatial patterns of where which ecosystem services will be potentially affected by natural disturbances and to what extent. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this map, but I just want you to realize that there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity, so the risks are not the same everywhere. And they also depend on how we manage the forest and on what the level of demand for ecosystem services is. So there are some areas where it's more important to maintain, for instance, the protection function of forests, but others where it's okay to let natural processes take place. And it's important to understand this and to understand it spatially so that we can prioritize where we need to do which kind of interventions. But one thing we found is that a very high provision of ecosystem services, so for instance, high level of carbon sequestration or high protection function, is often also associated with a higher risk. So some key take-home messages that I want you to take from my talk and also from others today is, firstly, that remote sensing can be a really useful tool to map and monitor both disturbances and ecosystem services, but we still need a lot of local knowledge and information to give this data a context. We know that these spruce forests that are on former agricultural land and very homogeneous are particularly susceptible. And so in these forests, we have to be careful about the timing of management interventions. But we also can consider that these disturbances can be a catalyst of the transformation of these forests towards a more resilient structure. And mapping the risk of ecosystem services, when we include also the demand for ecosystem services, can help us identify priorities for adaptation. And we have to be aware, as we've already heard today, of the potential trade-offs, for instance, between maximizing the current ecosystem service provision and having a more stable and robust ecosystem provision in the future. But one thing that I also want you to remember is that a lot of these things are associated with a high uncertainty, both what will happen with the forest in the future and how the ecosystem services will take place in the future and what people's demands for ecosystem services will be. So it's important to be aware of this uncertainty and to manage for resilience so that we can adapt to these potential changes and to also monitor and adapt as changes happen in the future. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Anna, for this overview on management issues. And you excuse my voice. And we are going to move on to what is entitled the wrap-up policy framework on sustaining of ecosystem services. It's going to be given by Giorgio Vacchiano. You know him already from the first session. He was the chairman. So please, Giorgio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. So my presentation is going to deal with policy incentives and support to providing ecosystem services by mountain forests. I'm going to wait for some seconds for the slides to appear. If they don't appear, I can just do without them. Looking at the tech people.
Can we get the slides for?
Okay, I'll start speaking. I know my speech,
that's
so
great.
I can skim through it, and maybe I will also save some time to us
That's
all.
good.
By summarizing it in a few key points. So we have already heard that mountain forests and alpine forests play an important role in providing ecosystem services. In fact, according to the last assessment report of European ecosystems, forests provide about half of the economic value of all ecosystem services by ecosystems in Europe. And that's about 200 billion euros, which is the same amount of revenues from the agricultural and forest sector continent-wise in the European Union. The same assessment tells us two interesting things. On one hand, the level of provision of ecosystem services in the last 10 years has not increased. It has been stable or decreased in 50% of the cases. On the other hand, the demand for these ecosystem services, especially regulating ones, has increased in 85% of cases. So we have a kind of a mismatch here, and we need instruments to incentivize and promote the maintenance and improvement of ecosystem services by forest to answer to these pressing demands. At the European level, some policies have been put in place since quite some time. Actually, three things need to happen. One, we need a common framework, a common agreement on how to measure and what to measure. So what kind of ecosystem services are there? And this has been done already since 2009 with the CICES framework, so a standardized framework of how to describe ecosystem services by European forests. Second, we need actually to know what's there, to measure them. And there are both continental and nationwide initiatives to measure the level of provision of forest ecosystem services. The most recent of which is the MAES framework, which measures actually the level of forest ecosystem services in Europe. But we also need a third thing, which is schemes to incentivize forest owners and forest managers to manage their forests in order to provide the services, both from a productive point of view and from a regulating point of view, for climate mitigation, adaptation, water regulation, soil protection, all the things that we've been hearing. And in my slides, I had some key points from a paper that came out a couple of years ago. Okay, maybe I can resume. Thank you to the tech people for bringing it back. So a paper that analyzed EU policies to see how they are incentivizing the provision of ecosystem services by forest owners and managers. And what came out is three main points. One is that actually few policies mandate member states to report on the stocks and flows of ecosystem services. So the reporting is there, but it's not yet mandatory. Second, most policies focus exclusively on one category of ecosystem services. So we have, for example, the Water Framework Directive that focuses on water provision. We have a climate mitigation strategy that focuses on climate mitigation, but it's hard to find policies that actually incentivize more than one ecosystem service at a time. And this can be a problem because sometimes you have trade-offs. So you have actions that can increase one ecosystem services and decrease the other one. So in policies, I think there is still a need for more integrated promotion and incentives to take this fact into account. And in the end, most of European policies, with the exception of the Common Agricultural Policy, do not actually have a dedicated fund to implement ecosystem services, to incentivize owners. So this is left to member states, to owners, or to the free market. There are different ways, of course, in which you can incentivize the provision of ecosystem services. If institutional financing is not coming, then everything is left to the free market. But again, here we have something to do, something to improve, because the free market is not currently very well regulated. We have a lot of different standards to measure ecosystem services, to sell them over the counter, and to find sellers and buyers to make this link. There are, of course, different ways in which ecosystem services can be financed. Most of what happens now happens through direct financial payments. There can be alternatives like financial support for the communities that provide these services, or in-kind payments, or even other forms. And of course, there are a lot of buyers interested in buying ecosystem services that provide the common good for communities, including private businesses, which of course play a very prominent and important role in this economic exchange. But the market is much more complex than just buyers and sellers. There's a number of other subjects. This is an example from, for example, the carbon credit ecosystem, so just one kind of ecosystem service. So we have auditors, third-party certificators, investors, such as banks or insurance companies, pension funds. We have brokers that try to put together buyers and sellers. And all this is currently very poorly or very little regulated at European level and at member states level. So this leaves space for a lot of suboptimal exchanges, maybe greenwashing sometimes, so claiming that ecosystem services are there when in fact they are not there. The main danger, the main thing that we should remember here is that revenues and payments for ecosystem services should start from the criteria of additionality. So staying again in the carbon example, forests store carbon and they absorb carbon per se, okay? They carry out photosynthesis, so any forest does that regardless of what we do. What we should incentivize and pay is additional actions to improve this sink, this carbon sequestrations relative to a baseline. And this is not only for carbon, but for all kinds of ecosystem services. So it's very important to find agreements on how to describe these baselines and how, therefore, to highlight and quantify additionality. We try to do this with a Life Plus project happening in the Alps and Apennines, so Italian mountains. You can check online the different aspects of the project. In Italy, for example, we cannot currently claim carbon credits for the private market due to the unclear status of the Paris Agreement and carbon international negotiations. What we do here is to try and generate sustainability credits. So looking at carbon mitigation, but also disturbance prevention and increase of the protective effects of forests, which we have already heard about this morning. So my bottom line here is that we need policy to act on two lines. First, provide more certification and provide incentives from top down to regulate these kind of economic exchanges for ecosystem services. And second, as I had already the chance to say at the end of the first session, we need more forest planning. So everything that we are saying this morning depend crucially on the existence of forest management plans. And for example, in Italy, also one more result from yesterday's new data is that only 15% of forests currently have a management plan. This is unacceptable. This is not the way to manage a forest sustainably and to improve the provision of ecosystem services. Some conclusion points. For the ecosystem survey concept to be accepted outside of environmentally interested people, we have to draw attention to the economic benefits. And this is already happening. Natural capital accounting is entering the mainstream of businesses and also administrations. But we need policies and consistent policies from the European level and from member states to take ecosystem service provision and quantification into account. Thank you very much.